I am sorry, everyone, to be a little late to the party this evening, just the customary techno meltdown. I've got 3 computers going, and the one that's working is the one I least expected to be working. So tonight we have a very exciting and popular event lined up called the Invention of Narrative. Ania, Dabrowska, and Ektoras Arkomanis are going to speak tonight, discussing their approaches to incomplete narratives and their allure. I'm going to chair this evening. I'm standing in for Jane Klossick, who normally chairs. And my name is Matthew Barrack. I'm the research leader for the School of Art, Architecture and Design. We've been running this research seminar for some years now. And this year it has become particularly popular, partly due to going online. Our first speaker, or one of the speakers, which of you is speaking first, Ania or Ektoras?
May I, please?
Yes, of course. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Ania first. Ania has been teaching photography at the School of Art, Architecture and Design for several years. She's an award-winning artist. She works in photography, moving image, installation, text and sound. She has been putting together an extraordinary submission for the REF this year, which we're all being very excited to see come into being. She's interested particularly in the impact that different registers of time, space, and cultural identities might have on each other when configured in new works. Her projects are often socially engaged and use participatory and collaborative methods. Ektoras, I've been working with on the history and theory modules in the architecture school, but he has a much broader career than his profile as an architectural historian. He's a filmmaker and senior lecturer at the School of Art, Architecture and Design. His research revolves around urban areas which remain at the margins of history, planning, and the city's conscience. He uses film for its capacity to preserve and explore, but is ultimately interested in what it omits. And currently he's doing a lot of work around that question of omission with regard to decolonizing the curriculum in terms of architectural history and history more broadly. He's working on his second film at present, A Season in the Olive Grove, which is a documentary about the area of Elionas in Athens. So each of the speakers will speak for 25 minutes or so, and after that we'll have a chaired discussion. And if, as we are moving through the event, you would like to submit a question, use the chat column on the right-hand side. That means that when we start to open up the discussion, I can follow which questions to come to first and how to frame the themes of that discussion. So over to you, Ania.
Thank you very much. And Matthew, please do feel free to interrupt me if I run over time. I'm conscious of our limits, but I'm also conscious of my tendency to go on, but still bearing this in mind. Thank you so much to all of you for coming and joining us. I'm really humbled by seeing how many of us are here and really excited as well. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen now. Please tell me that you're seeing this slide.
Yeah, we're seeing your first slide and it's full screen. That's fine.
Okay, brilliant, fantastic. So thank you, Ektoras, for allowing me to join you in this conversation, because you were first scheduled here, and I love how we got to talk about some of the themes that might be exciting for us to mention in this conversation. And I love the fact that even the slide advertising our talk for today became a result of this dialogue between the two of us, 2 different research points, but probably quite similar, as you will see, points of reference and interest for this particular chapter. What I'm gonna be presenting to you today and talking about, it's very new. It's first outing, if you like. I've never showed or shared this particular research ideas. They are really in the seed, at the seed stage right now. So again, I'm feeling excited, but also please bear in mind that they are sketches and very raw material but it's very much embedded in my practice and an underlying foundation and frameworks that have been underpinning my work for a number of years. This kind of working title, Let's Meet Somewhere Suitable, is a fragment quote from a letter I've received from my dear friend, Chevril Robert Reitzing, who with whom I've been writing and corresponding for over 10 years. I will come to him a little bit later because he's, I guess, a center of my attention right here, and a very, is he just a friend? He's not. He's also a starting point, an inspiration for this project that I'm hoping to become a book, possibly an exhibition. For a number of years, I've been interested, as Matthew has kindly introduced me already, in collaboration, in questions and processes and methodologies of engagement with very frequently socially engaging participatory methodologies in questions of migration and memory, and especially the interception between personal memories and collective memories. I love when my work travels, when it's invited to be shown in unexpected settings and cross-referenced with other artists, because I'm interested in the dialogue that it creates. Archives in particular, and the question of memory, both personal and collective and cultural, and the impact of how different types of registers of archives and agencies of archives are playing part in construction of our identity, have been underpinning a lot of my project. This is something I've done for Wellcome Trust many years ago, and it resulted in a book, in an exhibition, in a number of talks, and it raised a lot of attention, partly because it was touching on ethical dilemmas about how do you work, how do you accept consent of people who are, for example, in this case, on the verge of losing their memory or suffering from dementia. How can ethically something like this be justified as part of a fabric that constitutes artistic practice? So perhaps because of that, or perhaps because very often my projects are collaborative and interdisciplinary. Here I was collaborating with cultural geographer Dr. Bronwyn Parry. They get to be shown on big platforms, sometimes mass media, sometimes big public exhibitions and public places. Oh, sorry, this is something that, is this, are we losing my images? I'm not seeing my images here, sorry. Oh, there you are. And the last project that I have submitted for REF, which Matthew was referring to, was one of such projects. It was a book, an exhibition, a series of events that were inspired and constructed based on an archive of over 27,000 images from the Middle East, where my role was, I guess, as both, it was published by Bookworks and the Arab Image Foundation in 2015, but shown in various exhibitions and iterations since then. The book and all these different, if you like, outputs and manifestations of the projects, they all played in some way with this question, which is our topic today, of how do we invent a narrative out of scraps of materials, and what kind of freedom can we I guess negotiate and enjoy as artists, especially when there are this kind of archival rigors at place or expectations. Of course, we've all might have been, through our research or personal experiences, used to different types of archives that surround us, that frame us, that sometimes affect us, and they might be institutional or political archives, or cultural archives, or personal archives, as our kind of family albums. This one here was an archive of photographs both authored and found by a Lebanese emigre who lived in Arlington, hostel for homeless people, where I met him when I was doing a residency, artistic residency. And the kind of images that I was interested in his work, some of them were documentary pictures that he showed, some of them were pictures that he collected from his neighbors and families, were the kind of narratives I was interested in curating and creating, which are two different, totally two different methodologies, of course, were sometimes referring to particular events, and sometimes there were events and narratives that I have constructed, playing with these images, if you like. And these permissions and, if you like, democracy involved in these processes of authorship and ownership of different images very often raised questions in different discussions and presentations, whatever. What right did I have as a Polish author and artist living in London to be playful in such a way? Oh, might be an issue if we're gonna be having this. Maybe I will have to change and swap to a PDF, because for some reason my PowerPoint has lost images here. Let me see, sorry, if I can switch to a PDF version of this talk. Are you seeing this now?
Yeah, we are seeing it.
I thought that maybe sometimes this happens when this will be, yeah. Oh, there you are. So this, the images here showing. So this was the book, a Lebanese archive. And we were here. And here I was talking about these different narrative devices that I invented, where I would put images together from different registers of time and place and space based on associations that I was making. And the kind of conversations and events that followed distribution of this project, or indeed even different appearances in different edited books, where fragments of my work were being invited to be included in different editions of different types of work. People would often come back to this question: why and how are you allowed to be doing this kind of interventions, archival interventions, if you like? Whether or not this is a question that we are interested in today is a different story. This was a presentation of this work at the Nottingham Contemporary in 2018, where you can see some of the work I created myself in Lebanon over the years, where I look at different interpretation of what an archive might be, and I interweave them, if you like, with moving image work and archival pictures that are taken or borrowed rather from Diab Arkasifi's original collections. The reason why I mention these works, which is because they frame this new research and this new material, and my kind of, if you like, they become a gateway to my thinking about this new project, which I'm just embarking on. This is, again, Lebanese archive shown under Hoxton Square in the public place. The kind of questions that came up again and again were about this, as I said, the centering of power, authorship and ownership of archives, disassociation of archives and the past, and these questions of how and why they might be relevant to us collectively in different context, in new context, but also archival agency and these questions of cultural diplomacy when pictures, images, and other archival materials might be reignited with new leaves of life in new contexts. So I'm coming back here to this conversation now, returning to this new material that has, I would say, no, it hasn't just landed on my lap. It has been slowly collected over a number of years, over 10 years. And in a way, it stems from exactly the same place as the archival Lebanese archive project has. So when I was an artist in residence at Arlington Hostel for Homeless People in Camden, I was commissioned to engage people who lived in the hostel and worked in the hostel in some kind of artistic methodology, artistic project, participatory project. The thing that I've started there was called Arlington Portraits, or later the project became known as the House of Homelessness, where I started with a grid of 100 and I believe 25 or 26 empty chairs, which represented the number of people living and working there. I've sent a letter of invitation to everybody to join me for this portrait, which was always meant to become a public exhibition of this empowered in style and aesthetic portraiture that borrows from painting. And everybody was sat in the same chair. People had a choice of whether or not I would title the work with their name, a job position or a title, and a status. Are they the worker, or are they the hostel occupant, or as they call them, client of the hostel. Of course, the work on many levels raises the kind of questions of whether or not we can challenge stigmas surrounding homelessness through these kind of processes. One of the people I met them was Chevril. This is the gentleman in question here. Chevril was already in his 80s when I met him. He was born in 31, and he would come to my studio on a regular basis. We would have conversations where I've recorded conversations with him. I photographed him every time he came, collected kind of oral history, so like of his life. That was the life of a man, a working man from working class, who was born somewhere in Sussex, and during the Second World War, when he was a small child, his parents died. He was split with his sister when taken to some orphanages, and because based on the gender they couldn't be together, because he was a boy, she was a girl, he lost touch with her. He then moved to London, changed his name to Chevril Wright-Sing, because his ambition was to write songs and sing songs. His real name was Robert. I don't know his real family name. So my relationship with him was always that of an artist meeting somebody in the process of making work. Once this particular project did very well. It traveled even, it was shown on the billboards of Times Square in New York. You can see a portrait of Chevril here during this particular exhibition where art takes Times Square competition, global competition, if you like. For one day was given access to all the billboards. So probably the most prized kind of location globally in terms of commercial value. And I found it very fitting that this portrait of homeless people could be shown there, elevating the status of this particular work just for one day and exposing this work just for one day to all these amazing spectators and audiences that gathered there for one day looking at the work. But again, this did get some coverage in press and magazines, and then traveled in various exhibitions to various galleries around the UK. Well, after my residency finished, I continued to meet Chevril on a regular basis. And of course, our relationship thus changed. We became friends, but continued. Every time I met him, I would take portraits of him. And there's always a question. I always told him one day, you know, I will want to make a book about you, because this book would be a portrait not only of you, but also of how we challenge, how we look at people who are homeless. Because of his looks and because of his very warm, amazing personality, he appeared in the work of quite a lot of photographers. This is just a picture I found online. I don't know who the photographer is. He wasn't named, but there was a very good quote that came with it. It was somebody who was making street photography, and once he took this portrait, he was offering a print to Chevreul, who refused, saying, "No, there is no need for having the likeness of myself. I just want to help you." He also featured in this Emma is Crying Instagram program that is run by Brian Badderman, who was also an artist in residence at Arlington, and who continued to work with Chevreul. Chevreul, as I say, I guess you know what's coming now. He died in September this year. And in a way, I know that I have always been waiting for him. He knew that for this project, I knew that this project could only come to life once he had passed away. And it's somehow related to my interest in the intersection of this, like, or maybe the changing nature of research and intimacy and research, the intimacy of friendship. And this is him on like a couple of days before he died in his hostel. And all these portraits, I must say, are taken with his permission and with him knowing that they would become part of this public work. Now, I am aware these are images from his funeral. I am aware that as an artist and person researching this, my emotions here are very much flavoring, if you like, and affecting the kind of narrative that might emerge from this. Is it going to be just a narrative? Is it going to be a documentary thing? I'm no longer interested in making a project that somehow captures his life in a documentary manner, but still, of course, once he died, I had an impulse, this documentary impulse, to capture the remaining ephemeral things that were accumulated in his room. And by the way, I've never ever seen him in his room until he was on his deathbed, because that was just a line of privacy that we never crossed. We always just met in cafes or went for walks. But there it was, this accumulated newspapers that he collected, bits of writing. These alone here were racing papers. I always knew that he loved betting on horses. He would play lottery forever, but a lot of the stickers, and there were like hundreds of them, sometimes were never checked or never collected. So maybe he was a cliche, story of a homeless old man who didn't have any family, who actually maybe was a millionaire. No one knows, but it contributes to this mythology and narrative curiosity and gap that may or not be invented. And then there were bits of his writing. Forever he had a kind of like his notes. These are like endless notes on different kind of betting systems that he was inventing, and the rules of betting that he would sketch out. And the writing that he gave me on the last visit I made before he died, like just like notebooks and notebooks of writing of different essays that were never published, never seen by anybody, all written, all handwritten. He was a man who didn't have a phone, who didn't have a computer, and they were on subjects such as humanity, why believe, where do we go from here. He was a futurist, a kind of self-taught, very well-read anthropologist. And interestingly, a lot of them are written on the back of various documents that he had been sent or given through the management, by the management of the hostel. So in evidence, they evidence a passage of time, but also social frameworks that support, but homelessness. So there would be messages from the hostel about window cleaning, or his kind of search for his family that is fruitless, his proof of residency that he's sending to get his over 60, what is it called, freedom pass. suspension of housing benefit. Sometimes on the reverse of these messages, you get this kind of really quite sad but interesting information about kind of conditions of living that we're not normally or usually privy to. Like, you know, sorry that you didn't have any access to the kitchen, but you will be allowed access to some smaller kitchen. Or of course, he keeps writing in between all these different documents. Sometimes they are letters from hospital about the state of his health, and they are mixed. They come from a number of years, stretching way back before I ever met him. Of course, some of them contain confidential information. So questions of like, you know, do I have a right to use or publish or include any of this documentation in the portrait that he makes, but also do I have a right to exclude them when I make this portrait? And is it going to be a portrait of a real person, or is it this book, this publication, going to be just, or Chevreul and his life story, is it going to be just a starting point for me, maybe dedicating this project and exploring through this project all sorts of narratives that were embedded in his writing, a kind of humanist interest in the future of a humankind, of a kind of invention. Here is a collection of letters, and, you know, again, there are boxes and boxes of these that he had sent to me and my son over the years. So there's this personal record of his writing and kind of document and evidence, if you like, of friendship between myself and him. But with each of this letter, he would always send cuttings from various newspapers, and I'm about to finish, I'm aware of the time, but cuttings of either pictures from magazines or newspapers that he found I would find interesting, or that he found interesting. And they, you know, they sometimes they are jokes, sometimes they are pictures of the royal family that he found, or sometimes they are articles on science or philosophy, or reviews of the books he would read. Sometimes perhaps he was my last ever friend that would surprise me with unexpected packages of real books and real letters that would come from my letterbox, and I would certainly miss that. But, you know, this is not why I'm interested in making this work. The kind of artifacts that I've accumulated, that I would kind of archive and put in my studio, waiting for this project to happen over the years now, constitutes of this kind of, the gifts that he would send, the cards. Well, here's a video I was hoping to play for you, but I can't, because it's a PDF. But it's a project where I'm like, I guess I'd almost like to leave a lot of this documentation and, if you like, evidential, archival backstories maybe to one side, in order to perhaps just create narrative, fictionalized ideas of what his life represented, or what his ideas, what his dreams might have been. And as such, perhaps this work is going to become much more abstract, and I'm interested to see how and where the archival material, which, you know, there's no doubt there's so much of it, and it creates a really fascinating kind of social, anthropological kind of document and a portrait of somebody who for over 30 years was seen and classified as a homeless old lonely man. But I guess there will be a room there to open the book and unpack the dreams that were contained in his life and in our friendship. And I'm going to finish with this because there's a few more slides, but we can come back to it, and pass the baton on to you, Ektoras.
Thank you, Ania. That's I think that is a very nice place to finish. I also I was very interested to see that inscription to Ania, the protagonist, and I'm sure we can come back and ask some of those questions, especially since you are clearly making him the protagonist in your new work of fact or fiction.
Mm.
Okay, so now we're going to hand over to Ektoras, and if you can aim to speak for around 20, 25 minutes, that will be great. It should leave us 20 minutes or so for questions. Over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you to Jane and Hannah for organizing this. I'm pleased to be here. It's wonderful to see so many people and so many names on the screen. I really enjoyed, I want to say I really enjoyed working on this in the very little time we had with Ania as well to meet up and exchange some rough ideas in the beginning. And it's something to remember if this talk coming up goes terribly wrong. At least I've got the preparation meetings as a nice memory. I'll share my screen now. Okay, is that visible? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll start with this poem by Patrick Razal, an instance of an island. One way to erase an island is to invent a second island, absolved of all the sounds the first one ever made. We don't know who concocted this one, where the triggerfish and clowns fade to inky neon dashes under a fisherman's skiff. A few plastic pontoons knock around makeshift slips. Dusk coaxes from the shore the small dull chime of a spoon against a pot, and TV voices, and on it goes. Even though the subject here seems to be the erasure of the original island, the poem centers on the second invented island, which is made up of various spectacles, from surreal to kitsch. And I read this poem as describing a history being eclipsed by another history or a system of belief. And it goes on, and the spectacles proliferate, and eventually we return. How can I forward? There we go. We return to the subject of the erasure towards the end, to read of another method of erasing an island. One way to erase an island is to invent the waters that surround it. This first island, we never hear about it. We never learn what has been erased. So it remains elusive, and the erasure is followed by a destruction by all the spectacles that unfold in the second island. And so the poem itself is a destruction. And this is a topic of my talk today, the refusal to speak of or to speak about certain things, the space of event being left blank. And some of the questions I have is what lies behind this poetic evasion, the refusal to speak of something that seems to be at the heart of the investigation, and what makes the narration of it or the fiction of it impossible. I also wonder about these films and texts that I'm looking at, if at some point they become complicit in the erasures they encounter by resisting narration, or at least conventional narration. Steve McQueen's film, Carib's Leap, is filmed in the Caribbean island of Grenada. There is no event depicted, just everyday scenes. So we see the pier, kids on the beach, locals outside a bar or cafe, fishing scenes, flying a kite, sometimes a close-up of a plant or an object that is hardly identifiable, reduced to textures and colors. The reason for being here, for being in this island, is an event that took place in 1652. Having repulsed the colonizing attempts of various European nations, the local Caribs were finally defeated and massacred by the French. And a small group of survivors were gradually pushed to the northernmost end of the island. And in the end, they leap off a cliff into the sea to their own deaths rather than be captured. This is what the title refers to, but again, we never hear about the historic event in the film. We know of it from accompanying texts and interviews, clippings from exhibitions, and so on. So if Rosal's poem about the island never reaches the elusive island, at least Steve McQueen in this film is on location. He does not speak of the event, but he speaks there. It's a case of spatial proximity, but temporal distance. And there is no attempt to reach towards the past. It seems that the historian has gone on a strike. This is important because it means that in a sense, the setting, the island, and everything that is on it remains uncontaminated by the film and the making of the film. And I think the prevailing feeling after watching the film is that the next day, the following day will resemble the last one. One way to explain the silence, the lack of commentary, the lack of approach to what has happened in the past, is perhaps to point out the unease that there is an unease with language. And English is my mother tongue, because this poem is my father tongue, is a foreign language. Languish, anguish, a foreign anguish. Perhaps there is a total distrust towards language. And so McQueen at some point turns to the ocean instead, where there's less information, no words, and so on. And I think this is the only moment where he can contemplate the leap by the people who jump to their deaths. Is this the parallel film then? Is this the film that McQueen wants to make? Another film I would like to talk about is Reassemblage by Trinh T. Minh Ha, which begins with this question, a film about what? She makes this film as part of her field work in Senegal. She's an anthropologist, Vietnamese American. And at the beginning of Reassemblage, well, this is the opening line. This is the first question asked. And so straight away, she seems to be distancing herself from a semiotic analysis, an analysis of semiotics or based on semiotics. She resents the habit of imposing a meaning on every sign, or at least she cannot perform it with this film. And one of the most famous and most reproduced lines in the film is this one: I do not intend to speak about, just speak nearby. So here, in this case, there is a declaration that the author will not speak about, the filmmaker will not speak of the event. We're near something, but there's spatial and temporal proximity, but we're not closer to knowing the subject. So there's a refusal to pin it down. In terms of the format of the film, we have song and sounds of rituals that are heard over long, dark screens. And it seems that we need to grasp things through listening an awful lot of the time. Then we have muted images, depriving the viewer of sound as a tool to decode the image. So I think it's the inherited grammar, the grammar of theory, anthropology, film, whatever that grammar is, and if it exists, if we assume that these different types of grammar exist, that Trinh wants to interrogate or turn down because it's an imperial device. So her film can be seen as an act of decentering or deferring, displacing, in order to understand her own actual and intellectual displacement, perhaps, of which she often writes in other works. It is a form of knowing that requires distance. I think this is one observation about both Trin's work and McQueen's work. They distance themselves, but isn't this distance from the subject also convenient in both of their works and in Revolves' poem? So I feel I have to criticize it at some level, if only in the sense that these works are worthy of criticism. I really love them. Reality is delicate, says Trin. And so my question is this lack of direct confrontation, or isn't it rather ultimately an intellectual evasion, an avoidance of sorts? And what of the refusal to step into the shoes of their protagonists, or a fear perhaps of identifying with them, even momentarily, in the face of the horror of history? In McQueen's film, there is this instance when he looks at the old face of an ailing woman resting. I think it's a fleeting moment of identification. He's close enough to someone to identify with them, and he is there. He's being there in order to salvage perhaps one's own humanity. Which brings me to one of my last examples, Saidiya Hartman's essay called Venus in Two Acts. Saidiya Hartman tells the story of a girl whose name is mentioned in an account found in an archive. The girl is one of two slave girls aboard the ship, and she's referred to as Venus during the trial of the captain of the ship. The trial is for misconduct. And we know of this from the archive. There is only a passing reference to her, to the girl, using her pet name, Venus, an invented name, which itself seems to have been invented to make cruelty, debauchery, and violence less disturbing, or works to that effect, at any rate. And this is an excerpt from the essay. What else is there to know? Hers is the same fate as every other Black Venus. No one remembered her name or recorded the things she said, or observed that she refused to say anything at all. Hers is an untimely story told by a failed witness. It would be centuries before she would be allowed to try her tongue. So the author cannot resign herself to not knowing anything else, and she ponders on reconstructing the girl's life with the purpose of imagining something more than abuse or disease or death. Can she reimagine aspects of the girl's life, perhaps through other accounts of slaves aboard ships or on plantations? Can she reverse the violence of the archive? Can she at least allow herself to imagine that Venus finds some solace in a friendship with the other girl that is mentioned? Some understanding that was manifest in brief moments when they were together or in close proximity. And the crucial thing is that she decides that she cannot. And this is where she exercises what I would call narrative restraint, or what she calls rather narrative restraint. The refusal to fill in the gaps and provide closure is a requirement of this method, she writes, as is the imperative to respect Black noise, the shrieks, the moans, the nonsense, and the opacity, which are always in excess of legibility and of the law. So Hartman has been bold, I think, where McQueen and Trin and Rosal have been apprehensive and have hesitated. She has confronted the awful silence, and she's been there to the historical event and back again. And she has attempted to reimagine, but ultimately she's faced with the moral predicament of inventing a narrative. So I guess my talk is also about refusing to invent a narrative, or mainly about that. And at this point, Hartman gives up, and she decides that she cannot and should not invent the details around the mention that survives, around this one mention of the girl. So closure is not possible, and along the way, stories of other people have been brought to the surface, slaves and perpetrators, records of trials and cruelty, and more rarely, of humanity. But Venus's story ultimately cannot be illuminated or be made human. She remains just a mention. I think I'm going to finish here, and perhaps there'll be more time to illuminate some aspects of this. I hope I'm on time. Thank you very much.
Yes, you are very much on time. We have, what do we have? We have about half an hour for discussion. I would like to encourage anybody who has a question to address to put it in the chat. I see there's a very long link to something in the chat from Joseph. Thank you, Joseph, whatever that is. But apart from that, we don't have many questions. We do have a question, perhaps which we'll come to in a moment. I'll just respond a little bit to the two presentations. I think they come from very different places to similar questions, and I think that is maybe what opens up the space for discussion. Both of them have embedded within them these ethical questions, but both of them have so very many questions embedded within them. And I think that a number of those questions come to rest on methodological issues, if you like, around what kind of form creative critical research practice might take around these issues of how to practice when dealing with real life issues to do with people's experience on the one hand, but also there's this, if you like, there's this account of something tragic or something painful or something lost in both cases. And it strikes me, well, I mean, maybe that's a negative way to say it, because I think there's a lot to be joyful about in the case of Ania's project with Chevrolet Reitzing. I sort of wonder if the questions that get asked around this, and this is a question for both speakers, but how do they position you as a creative critical research practitioner, or an artist, if you would like that title instead? In some sense, both of these pieces are about asking that question around, are you, instead of being the artist who goes and makes your own work and puts it in front, are you a witness? Are you a listener? Is your role to understand and to present some understanding which gets to grips with the difficulties, including the ethical difficulties, rather than presenting your own version of events? Yeah, can I ask Ania first?
Yes, thank you. Well, these are the questions that I'm enjoying actually exploring right now, because Chevrolet himself, and maybe, you know, like, how do you have a participatory and socially engaged methodology with someone who has died? You can't. You have to kind of borrow from either the artifacts or documents or documentation of exchanges that are left behind, so traces, some kind of archival traces, or ideas or inventions that I have of this person who, although has become a very dear friend, was ultimately still a stranger. You know, he was a person I saw maybe 4 times a year, but there was this other relationship that happened through letters, through correspondence, through sending of different packages, that I think evidences very clearly that we both became a fantasy of something to each other. And as maybe perhaps all friendships are, He was fiction. He was a fictional character. His name, the fact that by the time, when he had come to London in the early 40s, he dropped his identity. He changed his identity. He invented a new name for himself, and he became known by that name. Therefore, the traces of whatever his life was before are very limited. And then there is the so do I have an interest? I was talking to somebody a curator who works quite on many interesting projects, who was suggesting that perhaps I should talk to people such as Museum of London or somebody in Camden itself, because that would be the kind of place which would be interested in collaborating on commissioning some kind of work about him, because he was a homeless person who had lived in London for decades. But I'm not particularly, it's a wrong thing to say, but I'm interested in being a kind of a witness and an archivist and just putting these things in order and presenting them as some kind of edited archive of his real life. I'm much more drawn towards that artistic, if you like, creative license to invent and fill in the gaps, and perhaps to, what do you call it, Ektoras? You've said it. You not erase, but omit some of the like archival references and truths in order to give space to those writings. Those writings are like those kind of like essays, if you like. I call them in inverted commas essays, but the writings he had left so fantastical, but they really inspire, and I can imagine a moving image and sound pieces that contemplate the kind of ideas of humanist progress, if you like, for me as an artist, of looking at society and our culture and our place right now through perhaps a piece of abstract pieces, both moving image, photographic and sound, that somehow are framed by his writings. But
thank you. That's great. I mean, I think that this idea of being able to get at some kind of reality or truth of the individual or of the story, which would not be produced by simply reconstructing his life using the artifacts. But I think, just to move over to Ektoras, I actually saw that Steve McQueen installation on a double screen in Boston at the Contemporary Art Museum some years ago, and it is very interesting because it's on a loop, and you get the sense that it has this longing for something that is not there or is half remembered, or maybe it's when you wake up and you can't remember something quite correctly, and was it a dream, and so on. And this sense also of witnessing when you're an unreliable witness, or when what the memory is telling you is perhaps that something has been, as you said, erased, that there was a trauma. And a lot of the work in this genre often deals with that problem of trauma, which we can, when you think of with regard to Freud and the kind of responses to trauma of disavowal and so on. But I also think that there's something very interesting in the way that you presented that material, and it's a word that I think Ania used as well, about how you treat evidence and an aesthetics about it, an aesthetics about standing nearby but not pointing at the thing that is standing right in front of you where the crime was done. Is there a kind of evidentiary aesthetics that you're also looking for with regard to this version of history, or is it about maybe preserving that problematic character in the way that you're talking about history?
I think it starts from a relationship with reality, and I think a lot of these films that I referred to are actually contributing to a restoration of reality, or the restoration of our belief in the real, especially at the time they're created. So they're after the period where the traditional conventional documentary genre has been challenged, and so on. For me, it's interesting to explore these margins of identification, of when you're the filmmaker and how far you can go into seeing the world through your subject or protagonist's eyes, and when to do it exactly. And it's, of course, it happens inadvertently. You can't plan it, or you can't control it completely. One of the participants in this chat, in this event, sent me a link quite recently, and I was reading about it in a book by Pasolini, and it really attracted my curiosity how he refers to these moments where cinema becomes poetry because of this switch. Because suddenly you're able to switch from an outside point of view to share the world with your protagonist, and this trickles down to everything from the script to if it's a film we're talking about, to a method, or to the way you frame something, or whether the camera is handheld or not, but ultimately it is in the margins, or in between these shots, and in the switching of these perspectives. I think that poetry lies, and I'm hardly interested in anything else than poetry. I don't know if that sounds a little bit pretentious, but it's true. I don't care for so much else when I make a film, at least. I think the reality, I keep that quote by Trin, that reality is delicate. I think reality is very delicate because it's balanced very delicately between the sweetness of life, an extreme sweetness of life, and the horror or oppression of history, the past, and everything else that might oppress someone in their life. So this is how reality informs poetry. But of course, that can take many manifestations, many methodologies, and so on.
But if we're taking the view of the historian, and of course here, I mean, our examples are, if we're talking about Saidiya Hartman or Steve McQueen, these are not historians as such, but they are making the retelling of history their artistic business. And I do wonder that on the one hand, there are questions here of the aesthetic dimension of what one is trying to do. Certainly, in what we start to see, for instance, with Chevreul writing, but also ethical aspects. I don't know if Klaus is here still, but Klaus, perhaps you would like to ask a question about the ethics of this in relation to what you wrote in the chat, if you're here.
Yes, I'm here. I can even start the video, I hope. Ania basically raised the question of ethical concerns. But first of all, I would like to say that you, Ania, are in the perhaps enviable position that you can show glimpses of both islands, both the life and perhaps see what could have been in the writing, or the other person behind the homeless person. Now, a very simple test, if you have a research participant, I mean, basically you have permission for the photos and all that was talked about in your relationship, but you indicated some uneasiness about, what to do with all that you have now. And a very simple test is simply ask yourself what would have been in his best interest. What would he have wanted you to do? And that's a good guide when a research participant has died and you cannot ask them for consent anymore. And there's a dilemma. The dilemma might be that some state agency wants to get at your research material, and then, you know, a simple test. What would the research participant have wanted?
You say a simple test, and it's such a tease, Klaus. It's such a tease because, of course, that is, and thank you, but I think it is on such a personal thing, an arbitrary thing, and of course, as practitioners, we probably, I would say it's safe to say for all of us, and I don't know all of you, but it would be safe to say we do things that we believe are ethically right or morally right, because otherwise, why would we be doing them? But it's amazing how I seem to have stumbled on consent issues in almost every single participatory or kind of layered bigger project that I have done. It was either, you know, years ago I was doing a project with sex workers who around Tower Hamlets. For years I was documenting them working on the streets, them living in the housing, different places or squats or on the streets as well. And eventually I distributed a number of cameras to them and taught them how to use them to document their own lives and produce body of work that included both my photography of them and their own photography of themselves. And you would be amazed how some charities that worked with them had accused me of taking advantage of them, and or said that even with their consent of using portraits of them, I didn't really have a moral or ethical right to be including their portraits, which I've seen as empowering. Because there were often women who were vulnerable and, of course, sometimes under influence of drugs or alcohol. So how did they consent matter? It's the same case with Chevreul writing. I've got his consent, but it's not a case, I guess it's not a legally binding consent, because it's something that I'm personally very comfortable with. But even the hostel where he's alive right now would say that probably the kind of documents that I see as really interesting scraps of social frameworks that surround his narrative, or like those, you know, utility bills and letters, all of this is probably should be somehow protected. You know, who protecting whom? Is it protecting the institutions from revealing some kind of realities, or is it so not certainly not protecting him because he's dead? And he doesn't even have, you know, there's not no family of him. So I think what I'm comfortable with is not often guaranteed not to raise questions and eyebrows about the kind of ethical shaky ground of my license to take this, or even more so when you start inventing narratives and when this character, and I've never done it before in the project, and this is where I'm excited about doing it now, crossing that line and actually consciously leaving the Chevreul that I knew behind in order to perhaps pursue some kind of other places where his writing will take me.
This is a very, very interesting response, and we're getting a couple more questions coming up in the chat. But I think also for you, Ania, you are not you're not an unattached researcher. You said yourself, you've given the game away. You now are his friend. So in a sense, perhaps you feel that you have a responsibility to honor his memory, and maybe in a way it's also a privilege. So there's an obligation there, but the question is, how do you find that gap between being faithful and exploiting that material? But let's ask Trevor Norris. I think Trevor might widen the discussion also a little. Trevor, would you like to present your question for both speakers?
Yes, and it wasn't so much a question as an observation. I wondered if it struck a chord with you. I was reminded of the opening few pages of Sally Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and she talks about the method of using archives and using lives that aren't held inside archives, using fragments of lives. I think this is just a wonderful quotation, and what you both spoke about, brought this to mind. Every historian of the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and authority of the archive and the limits it sets on what can be known, whose perspective matters, and who is endowed with the gravity, sorry, that should be with the gravity and authority of the historical actor. And I wanted to ask you really to speak about this, the gravity and the authority of the historical actor, and where you see your own agency in relation to the projects.
Hector, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. I suppose I sit again in between disciplines because I teach history. I'm not comfortable with seeing myself as historian. I like this quote by Azoulay, Ariella Aisha Azoulay, that says, "What if historians go on strike?" And she actually encourages historians to go on strike. It's a chapter in her latest book, and of course she means it in a way that that if we take a pause, perhaps historians will serve the imperial power less, and so other things will come to the fore. I think, well, I start from a perspective that there are several histories that might have been oppressed, but they are written, so they exist. It's not just about erasures. It's about things that are there, that exist either in archives or as oral histories and so on. And so it's about taking the time and the effort to hear them and communicate them. But as I said, I sit in between disciplines, and so I don't want in my films to be a historian. I suppose the difference is that from an artistic point of view, I think it's necessary that your view at some level or other is also a worldview. So if it comes across as a worldview from your body of work, then you have said something important. Of course, that's again often not deliberate. But I'm not in that respect. I'm not too bothered about the historian's role, or at least I'm slightly liberated from it, or I hope to be if I'm not, so that it can work as a form of art. I try not to be reckless. I don't want to misrepresent anyone, but fiction is necessary, and I suppose this is the whole point of my presentation. What are the limits of fiction, or the impossibility, or the point that you choose to not invent a narrative, which I'm very fond of, inventing narratives, but there is a moral responsibility or barrier or boundary that has to be respected.
Thank you. I mean, she goes on in this note on method to talk about the wayward errancy of her project, and there is this extraordinary invention of these lives that are barely documented, and the lives themselves have this wayward errancy, and so her method must have that wayward errancy as well. It sounds like.
Can I just add to that yes, I think there has to be a margin for error and risk and scandal. Scandal is also necessary, and and without scandal, there's not an awful lot left in art.
That should really have been the title of your presentation, without scandal.
I was thinking, I was fantasizing about T-shirts with good slogans: "Fiction is necessary" and "Scandal is necessary." I think that's.
Yeah, well, we're supposed to still come up with a new name for art, architecture, and design. Maybe we can call it the School for Scandal. Can we go to another question from the chat? Nick Temple, are you still here, Nick?
Yeah, I'm here. Yes, this is for Ania. It's I'll read the chat box. This is what I've written. It's not very well put together. I'm just putting forward the question of treating the homeless person's writings, his legacy, as aesthetically constituted fragments that may not require interpreting as research material, as one would perhaps expect would be the case with a recognized writer? Are these conceived as personal works not for public scrutiny, or simply of little interest? Or do they require, or do they inform the larger visual narrative of his life in the work that you produce? The reason I'm asking this is because I guess if it was not a photographer doing this, but somebody who's obviously engaged in, let's say, the biographical nature of his life through his writing, obviously this is maybe something that you discovered quite late on in your encounter with him, and therefore it's something that may not have been on the record as part of his life as what he did. But I'm kind of intrigued by, I guess, the idea of a photographer recording the text, but not actually, I no doubt you've read it, but not actually using the text to inform the visual material, put it that way. So how does that, where does the text as a written document inform your portraiture and your investigation of him as a person?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, first of all, I'm familiar with his writing has been at the very beginning of our relationship, because when we first met in my studio in the context of participatory art project, or in socially engaged art project, if you like, which was photographic on one hand, but also involved kind of collaborating or encouraging people who lived in this hostel to engage with me in some way. And so some people took photographs and we invented kind of visual dialogues. And Chevril had talked to me, and we very consciously recorded this kind of histories that he was offering, all written, and I encouraged him to write. So he would, let's say, that's how the whole writing process started, and when it started for him. So that was 10 years ago or something. And at the exhibition, which was ending my residency at Arlington in 2012, I found that some of the writings that he did, I tried to transcribe it, and in the way that it's funny that you calling me a photographer, because I don't really see myself as a photographer. Certainly, I'm a senior lecturer in photography, and a lot of my practice, maybe most of my practical making, stems from photography and touches on photography. But there are so many other things that happen around it that the photographer label is like one of the things that I do. So when I was looking at his work and his writing to incorporate it in the exhibition of my work at the residency, I've transcribed it, and I tried and experimented with different kind of printing and layouts and graphic design. And what I found is that the actual content was then reduced to something, it lost a lot of its meaning. So what I realized that perhaps there is a marriage there between the trace, the indexicality of his handwriting, the kind of paper that he uses, that he, by the way, he used to work as a porter at Savoy Hotel for years, like dealing with cars, but also helping with cleaning. So that's part of his biography. So a lot of writing, that blue paper that he sent me, was actually from some stationery cupboards in Savoy Hotel in the 80s. And that alone is like interesting to me, that the kind of the materiality of those letters and artifacts, the traces of the handwriting that we no longer do, as a society. My child, who is 6, is being taught to write very differently to the way that he was taught to write. So these kind of scraps of material evidential indexality of these letters are important to me, or as important as the actual content of what he writes, and they become aestheticized, of course, in some way. I'm not belittling what he's writing, but I think the form of his writing and the form of the letters is as exciting to me.
Okay.
Thank you. I think before we go over to, we're going to have time probably for one, or if there is more than one, probably one more question, and then closing statements from our speakers. I'm going to invite, Joseph has written something very which is worth reflecting on. And Joseph, would you like to take us through what you've written in the chat or presented just in the seminar?
Thank you. Thank you, Anna and Hector. It was really very enjoyable to listen to you and very thought-provoking. It's not really a question. I just wanted to say that I was particularly Hector's focus on thinking nearby as a approach, which I think applies to both of the talks, is really well, has provoked in me thinking that we have a lot to learn about what happened in the last 50 to 60 years, particularly after the Second World War in Europe, and different approaches to public art and the memorial. And I was putting a very concrete example in the post about the 2 Holocaust memorials in Vienna, one by Alfred Rydlichka, which is extremely graphic in its depiction of torture and pain, and Rachel Whiteread's very quiet, fairly abstract approach. And I just wanted to say that if we are ever in doubt which of the 2 approaches might be the more sustainable one, which one of the 2 approaches might be possibly even the more powerful one, we have evidence now to see that the thinking nearby approach is where there's enough space for reflection for everybody to come on board and think, and where we have maybe stand a chance to resolve some of the ethical problems that are being discussed today. And any visit to these memorials will tell you today that, you know, where around Rachel Whiteread's plinth is full of candles and flowers, whereas Alfred Rydlichka's memorial tends to be the backdrop for Antifa demonstrations. So it is. I don't know, it's not a question. I was very moved by this, and I thought that if anybody ever doubts whether thinking nearby can be as powerful as pointing the finger at something, we already see now that it can be.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that phrase that we had from Hector about thinking nearby, I think that was that it's very interesting. It takes me back to the way that Heidegger writes about nearness in relation to some kind of pursuit of arguably what we might describe as truth, that you can't, or the idea that you can't look directly at the sun because it'll turn you blind, but you can feel its light. And the mimetic impulse being one in which that nearness is more authentic than simply trying to create everything into an object for contemplation. And also just reflecting on, firstly, what you said, Joseph, about collective remembering, and also Ania's version, perhaps, of thinking about Chevreul's life. Is he a hero? Is he a villain? How do you tell that story in a way that is a true biography? And this definitely resonates with aspects of Hector's suggestion that those stories will be incomplete. I'm just reminded, and this is perhaps to prompt some closing remarks, reminded of someone a sociologist who's had a very big impact on aspects of my way of thinking, who is Charles Wright Mills, who came up with this fantastic phrase talking about the relationship between personal experience and, if you like, the kind of institutional structure by means of which official history is made. And he describes this as the reciprocity between biography and history, and perhaps not aiming too much for everything to be on the same page, but looking at the gaps between biography and history, that being where the truth might reside. So I do see we do have a closing message on chat. Aha, okay, Hector has his hand up. So I'm now going to hand over to Hector, and then I'm going to hand over to Ania to close, and then we'll say goodbye. So Hector.
Yeah, well, first of all, as much as I would like to take credit for the speaking nearby phrase, it's not mine, it's it's by Trinity Ha. And I think it works to a certain extent, but you know, there's also criticism towards it, I think. And I think it works with the political and the historical event. It can definitely be an evasion, an intellect, or, you know, some people might call it an intellectual cowardice. But I think it's very much, it has very much to do with the topic or the event. And I think most of all, it has to do with realizing that the available language, again, if we can call it that, but whatever you want to call the tools that are in someone's disposal when making a film, they're very heavily colonized or for any reason unsuitable. So I think there is a point about that specifically that Trinh makes. So there is a good reason for it to avoid this grammar. And I think perhaps this is what we have to think in terms of the research, because I can't think of any institutional practice or framework that is more colonized than research as we know it. I mean the ref, for example, because it doesn't allow for different forms, or even if it does, you know, it imposes at the end of it, you know, the same talk about methodology, about research questions and all that, and this is not open to a lot of people from other nations and non-Western creeds or countries and so on. And you know, it's amazing how little it's being acknowledged that that a lot of these fictions that are found elsewhere can never be incorporated without becoming colonized. So the ref or research in its existing current form, and I'm not talking about the body of research, I'm talking about the framework, is heavily colonized, and no one seems to take a lot of notice. The people who take notice and who want to hold that into question, they have to do it through the same method. They have to have some research questions and some methodology that obey the same rules. So anyway, that's part of my presentation, I suppose, in terms of fictions and how they how different types of narration can be embodied through film and texts that are not necessarily always familiar to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. So we managed to get over to a critique of the ref there, but Ania, maybe just I'll give you the last word, and you can perhaps cheer us up a little bit at the end of this.
Oh, what pressure here! But I wanted, I just wanted to say I had a little Vimeo piece of him talking to camera, which was quite humorous when he was reading one of his essays about aliens and his belief, and he used beautifully old-fashioned language, but you know, where cars are still automobiles and so on and so on. So it's a pleasure to listen to, but apparently the Vimeo doesn't transmit through this process. So I've got I'm thinking here about something you said, Matthew, about this gap between biography and history, and also the fact that this project, I'm not really interested in writing his biography as such, to like, it's a wrong territory for me. But speaking of this kind of gap, and given that a lot of these essays or writings are entitled with big philosophical things and questions, and humanist and futurist ideas like aliens or age, marriage, sex. There's an interesting one about sex, or procrastination. There is one letter in particular, and this is what I'm going to end with, which gives us a sense of history and conditions. Floor polish communal area. Dear Sir, Madam, we are writing to inform you that our contractors will be performing floor polish on each communal area of the building. I'd like this, it's like something out of Bennett, really. The work is due to start at 10 o'clock and it will take approximately 15 working days to complete, excluding weekends. As part of this work, they will take a day and a half to complete each floor. Please, I would like to remind you to be very careful, as floor will be slippery and wet signs will be visible on site. On the reverse of this letter, there is his essay that says, Can you read it? No, you can't read it, damn it.
Can't really read it, no. What does it say? Tell us.
Value of life.
The value of life.
Thank you, Nick.
Wow. That's
And this one page remains absolutely empty and there is nothing written on that. So I leave you with that beautiful, empty, negative space, which we can all fill with our own expectations and dreams. You are the protagonists.
Thank you very much, Ania. Thank you, Ektoras and Ania.
Thank you all.
Thank you for coming tonight. Please do tune in next week. Sign up for next week's event on Eventbrite and follow us on Twitter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.